Welcome to our estate planning discussion today. We're going to be touching on the concept of asset protection planning. And, this is one of the topics that has become a hot button, I think, in the estate planning world and in a lot of, just casual conversations that people who haven't thought about estate planning in the past possibly, or haven't done their planning properly in the past, are now thinking about. And part of it is now more than ever, we're seeing a very litigious society, and we're seeing lawsuits against people for, all kinds of things that, quite frankly, are very frivolous sometimes. But we've, noticed in the COVID world, I was sitting down with one of my friends who's a litigation attorney, and pretty much all he handles is lawsuits between companies and between high net worth individuals. And what he told me is that, COVID really blew the top off of litigation. And part of the reason is that, all the stress and everybody, being cooped up at home, and a lot of individuals that own, real estate properties that their tenants weren't paying them for a long time, and, business stress and everything else has just kind of caused a lot of these individuals to just think every day of who they can possibly sue to be able to get money from. And I know that that's the case, with individuals who have had bad experiences working with professionals or maybe been injured. And so, we live in a very litigious society now more than ever. And let me just share an example because, this is kind of how it pans out when there is an injury or something that comes up that could cause potential liability for somebody. And we've seen a situation where we have an 82-year-old woman, and she was driving in Southern California. She was in a minor car accident. There was a guy who was working on a vehicle. She ended up hitting him. It wasn't a major injury. In fact, he went to the hospital, and the first hospital he went to turned him away and said that his injuries were not, anything that was treatable, that needed to be treated, or that he could get a diagnosis for. So he had to go to another hospital before they gave him, any sort of diagnosis. But the next thing you know, even though there was only one person that had gotten injured, next thing you know, there were 2 lawsuits against my client, right? And she wasn't my client at the time, but she has since become my client. And the reason was because there was somebody on the street corner that watched the accident happen, and they sued her. And the person that actually got hit, that actually got injured, also sued her, right? And so what grounds they sued her for? Well, I'm not really sure, because there wasn't any grounds for the person on the street corner to be able to sue her. But that's actually what happened. So, logistically, what happens when there's a claim against you or a potential litigant is that they go and they sit down with an attorney and they say, hey, I got injured. I was in a car accident. I want to see if I have any claims. And then the personal injury attorney says, okay, well, who hit you, right? And so then they look up the person and try to find out what sort of assets or what sort of resources that individual has. In this case, our client, an 82-year-old, she lives on Social Security. She doesn't have a, strong income or anything, but she does own a real estate investment property with a multi-unit complex. I think it's a 4-plex. And they found that, she owns that building and there's no mortgage on it, right? Because it's all public information that they could just look up. And so they said, oh, this lady has some money. So that's why they went after her. And now there was 2 lawsuits against her, one completely frivolous and the other one that, did have a little bit of validity to it. But in any case, they were suing her for, I think it was $300,000. And above and beyond, the insurance limits. And so she was quite worried and, very perturbed by this. And, luckily we were able to help her, put her in a situation where she could settle the lawsuit and kind of get out of the problems. And believe it or not, the person on the street corner did get money in the settlement. So this just tells you, what kind of society we live in and how litigation and the liability that can come across to people is a big deal. And it's something to be concerned about. Just a couple years ago, Gwyneth Paltrow, we all know that name from Iron Man, right? She was on the ski slopes in Utah, and there was an old man that was on the ski slopes as well, and she bumped into him. She didn't knock him over. She didn't injure him. There wasn't really any damage. But the next thing you know, she has a lawsuit against her for battery, right? Because she knocked into him. And the reason is, again, because she has a target on her. She has a lot of assets. And so because of that, there's potential litigation that people would pursue just to try to get to those assets. So asset protection planning is all about protecting yourself from those situations. And one of the ways we do that is by enhancing the privacy of your assets. If somebody goes to a personal injury attorney or a litigation attorney and they tell them that they've been injured and they say, this is the person that injured me, and then they look you up and they find out that you have nothing in your name, then it's going to be a lot less appealing for them to try to go after you. So privacy is your friend when it comes to asset protection planning. The second thing is, if the attorney looks you up and they find out, oh, you know what? The assets that this individual has are protected by LLCs. They're protected by trusts. They're protected by, multiple structures. And in order for us to be able to collect, even if we win, we're going to have to break through those structures. And that increases the cost of litigation. It's very likely that in those scenarios that litigation counsel is not going to take the case on what we call a contingency. And a contingency is where they don't charge anything up front because they know they're going to collect on the back end. When they see that there's barriers to collection, when there's entities they have to break through in order to be able to try to collect or anything like that, then it's very unlikely that they're going to try to do that without getting paid, because there's no way that somebody's going to want to go through that process and dish out all the money in order to possibly get paid and possibly not get paid, right? So they're going to ask for payment up front in order to be able to do that. So that significantly reduces the likelihood that they're going to go after you and that they're going to actually initiate the lawsuit. And then the third aspect of asset protection planning is we want to create layers of protection for you. Some of those layers are going to be entities or structures, like we just talked about, that protect your assets. And some of those layers are going to be insurance, because we want to disincentivize them continuing any litigation against you by increasing the cost of collection, the cost of litigation. Try to find laws that are going to be more favorable for you and less favorable for them. But then the second part is we want to put you in a very strong position to settle the case. So if you have layers that are insurance related, like umbrella coverage, like errors and omissions or general liability coverage, like homeowners insurance, coverage and so on. Those insurances pay out when there's legitimate claims, but they only pay out if the person that's suing you stops moving forward with the litigation. And so the idea is to have these layers of protection, whether they're LLCs or corporate structures, or maybe they're trust structures, or maybe it's even just your personal estate plan. Those layers create disincentives for somebody to try to litigate because they have to break through those, and it's going to be costly for them to do it. But they don't get any of the insurance money until they decide to drop the case and stop moving forward. So the best asset protection structures and plans are going to have multiple layers of protection, and each layer will be sandwiched with insurance protection. And then that provides a very strong incentive for them to settle a case because not only do they spend more money if they keep going, but they don't get the money that they would have gotten if they stopped. So asset protection planning can be very complex. It's one of these areas that sometimes is marketed as, a silver bullet kind of approach, or if you do this, you're never going to have somebody collect against you and you have a foolproof sort of system. But the problem is that sometimes the marketing around asset protection planning can be a little over the top. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you don't need everything that you could implement for your asset protection planning. If you over implement, you're just spending, more money and kind of approaching it, but it may be, overkill. It may be using a bazooka to kill a fly, right? And so asset protection planning is one of those areas that we try to look at a proportional response to the type of liability that you could confront. Some professions have a lot more liability than others. Some professions are it's very risky, and depending on what state you're in, to actually have personal liability against you. In today's day and age, anybody who is a first responder, police, those sort of situations, they used to be indemnified from liability personally. Nowadays, they might be personally liable for those sort of things. If you're a professional like a chiropractor, doctors, attorneys, dentists, anything that you do is the work of your own hands. And therefore, you could be personally liable for anything that goes wrong. Malpractice coverage covers something that you do wrong as a professional, but if you don't have enough coverage or the limits aren't high enough, or, heaven forbid that you don't have any, right? I was talking with an OBGYN in an airport once, and I was asking him, what kind of protection in terms of, malpractice coverage he had. And he said that he didn't have any malpractice insurance. That, he and a few other doctors just put money into a pool so that if there's any claims against them, then that money's going to respond for the claim, which is okay. But then I asked him, well, how much money do you have saved up in there? And he said, well, close to $1 million. And I said, okay, well, there's 4 of you doctors that are contributing to this pool of money. How often have any of you had a claim? And he said, well, so far, we just started doing this a couple of years ago. We haven't had any claims. And I said, okay, in your line of work as an OBGYN, if there was a claim against you, if there was a lawsuit against you, what's the average amount that they would be claiming, that they would be trying to sue you for? And he said, well, industry average is probably, a couple million. And I said, so you don't even have enough money saved up between the 4 of you to handle one claim. What happens if a couple of you have claims against you at the same time? Because, by the way, liability is one of these things that tends to domino. If somebody gets a successful, claim against a doctor in a specific area, then there's going to be other clients in the same area that are going to jump on that bandwagon and try to sue, right? And I said, okay, do you have any asset protection in place to protect your personal assets if the money that you guys have put aside to settle these claims, if it's not enough? And he said, no, I haven't done any asset protection planning. So not only did this guy not have any insurance coverage, but he also didn't have any structures in place to protect his personal assets. And because he's, a doctor, the work of his own hands, if something goes wrong, again, he's going to be personally liable for that. So a lot of times professionals take unnecessary risk in their professions because they haven't properly planned or properly structured things in order to avoid those problems that could come up. So, we highly recommend, if you are one of those types of professionals, that you set up an asset protection plan to protect you from your business liability. The reason that it's a little bit different for professionals is that if you are a business owner in general, your business is your first line of defense. So your LLC, your corporation, if it's properly structured and you have the right things in place, And maybe that's a discussion for another time. But if it's properly structured and you have the right things in place, then you don't have to worry about your corporate liability or your business liability, because it won't affect you personally. It'll stay inside the business. But for these kind of professionals that we talked about, the work of their own hands, your personal services that you're providing, that bypasses corporate liability protection. So you can't just cut off liability because you have an LLC or because you have a corporation. It will still attach to you personally. And so it's important to have a proper plan to address that. And again, if you have assets that you've saved up, that you've invested in, that you've acquired, that are personal assets like investment properties or rental properties or, other things like that, those are also exposed to personal liability. And, sometimes we think, well, that wouldn't happen to me because I'm not a professional, right? But consider this. We had a situation where there was a 7-car pileup. This was in Northern California, 7-car pileup. The person that caused the accident was the one that was, going to be responsible for all the damage to all the cars. Well, the 7-car pileup included a Lamborghini, 2 BMWs, a Tesla, and a Ferrari. I mean, what are the chances that out of 7 cars, 5 of them are probably worth, $100,000, right? But that's just how it turns out. You never know, right? And so the limits on your car insurance, especially if you have minimum limits, are probably not going to be enough to cover that accident. And that's where all the excess will come to you personally. That's the need for asset protection planning, right? And so I think it's very important to consider having an asset protection plan, have the right documents in place, protect yourself, make sure that you're addressing your asset protection planning appropriately. And we'll get into more details on asset protection planning in future podcasts, but hopefully this is a good introduction. And, anybody who's here today, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or let us know. We can try to unmute you so we can address those questions. Anything related to asset protection planning or what we've covered today? All right, we do have a question. The question was, if you're a business owner and you have your business registered with the state, is that enough to protect yourself from liability from your business? So real quick, we'll just kind of go through the 3 things that you need as a business to maintain what we call the corporate veil, which is what protects you as a business owner from business liability. Those 3 things are, number 1, your business has to be registered in good standing with the state. And so that's what you were just asking. That's the first component. The second component is you have to have proper accounting practices. And that means that no commingling between your business expenses or business assets and personal expenses or personal assets can exist. If there's commingling, then it can undermine that protection. And number 3, you have to have the right legal documents to protect you. So those could be contracts, they could be vendor agreements, they could be employee contracts. But the most basic documents that you need would be for an LLC, an operating agreement, and for a corporation, what they're called bylaws. If you don't have those documents, then the court may consider that you didn't treat your business as a real business, and then they'll bypass the protection that you would have had otherwise. They'll pierce the corporate veil. So unfortunately, a lot of times when people set up their companies, they don't do all 3 of those. They don't set up a separate bank account, or they don't keep their accounting proper, or they don't have an operating agreement because they have their CPA set it up, and CPAs are not licensed to set up legal documents, right? So they may or may not have done your operating agreement. And so a lot of times people go without those things, and then at the moment when they're sued, they realize that they're not protected. And sometimes, business owners, they fail to keep the registration up with their business. We just had a high net worth client of ours that was in a situation where he was going to be sued because of an issue with his lease agreement. And they sent him a letter and they said, hey, by the way, did you know that your business registration is out of date? Therefore, we can pierce the corporate veil and go after you personally, right? And that's what happens. So it's very important to make sure you stay up to date on your registrations, make sure that you have your business accounting completely separate from your personal, and that you have the right legal documents in place. And if you don't have that, then of course, meet with a competent legal counsel to review things for you. Any other questions before we wrap up here? All right. Well, we appreciate you joining us, and definitely look us up and listen to previous recordings of the podcast. Make sure you subscribe so that you can receive notices of our new and upcoming podcasts. And we appreciate you joining us today. And we'll be talking further next week about tax planning and a little bit more about, we've covered previously the exemption limits for estate taxes. Next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about capital gains taxes and planning around those. So appreciate you joining us today, and we'll look forward to talking to you all soon. Only a small percentage of our listeners are actually subscribed, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and catch up on all of our latest podcasts.